Well, thank you very much, John, for that warm welcome, and I'll be selling the sizzle here this morning, I hope. Good morning to all of you. Thank you for inviting me to open the conference this morning, the second day of Radio Days Ireland. Garamila Mahagath, I will say, and that will be the beginning and the end of my Irish interventions this morning. So I think Lisa knows well that it never takes long for me to accept an invitation to come to Ireland. As you'll see by my name, if not by my accent, I'm obviously very much at home. My father's from Roscommon and my mother's from Galway, so I'm really more at home in the west of the country, but you know, we'll be talking about bringing things together today. So if ever I'm in a good position to understand the kind of cultural connections between our two countries and also the things that kind of that hold us apart at times. So let's have a look at some of those today. I mean, if ever I'm in danger of forgetting any of that, by the way, I have a lot of relatives in the west of Ireland who are keen listeners to Galway Bay FM and Midwest Radio and Clare FM, who will be very keen to point out where I'm getting it wrong, and which they do quite a lot. So the Kennys of Ballintubber have always followed my career, as I'm sure all of your families do with your own careers, and they like to put most of it down to my Irish ancestry, which is fair enough. So they were never so delighted as when I got a job as a junior civil service press officer in the number 10 press office and in the late 1990s. So I spanned the period between the late part of John Major's administration and 5 years of Tony Blair. So that was a tale of two cities in and of itself. But obviously, Ireland was a great preoccupation for both of those two prime ministers, as it tends to be for most British prime ministers, but particularly at that time because of the Northern Ireland peace process. So regularly there will be I can't even remember what the story was at this time, but there will always be a story where something happens in Northern Ireland which requires, and the Irish media very keen to get the input from the UK government's perspective. So something has happened one day, phones are ringing off the hook, and the Irish Times are wanting to get a comment from the UK Prime Minister. And the office manager was heard to say at that point, I'm really sorry, they're both on the phone, but the only people you can talk to about the Northern Ireland peace process is either Siobhan Kenny or Paddy Feeney. At which point the Irish Times said, well, that's colonisation in reverse, and I'll wait a long time to speak to either Siobhan Kenny or Paddy Feeney about what's going on, what the UK government thinks about what's going on in Ireland at present. So that's really about the kind of trajectory of my relatives in the west of Ireland, always keeping it real for me. So I want to talk today about the developments in UK radio, particularly over the last 5 years, and how we've moved quite a lot, as John was saying, from that position of being quite defensive towards the government in particular, to try and tell a more positive story about our industry, and I think that's been achieved by working together. So I'm a great one for the power of working together. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that this morning. The last time you invited me here to talk, it was about deregulation in the UK, so that was a couple of years ago, as you see, 3 years ago. We are now looking at the results of what's happened following on from that deregulation. It's obviously allowed Heart and Capital to compete against the BBC on national breakfast shows in the morning. And I'm going to be talking a little bit more about some of the other things that have fallen out of that deregulation. But first of all, I think I want to just clarify what my organisation does. Yes, we market the medium of radio. We do three things, really. Market the medium of radio, which in this time of, people being keen to look at what is the next big thing coming out of Silicon Valley, it's really important to articulate your story in a way that puts radio at the heart and centre of the audio revolution. So that's been a big push behind everything that we've done in the last few years. We also, as John mentioned, we talk on behalf of the whole industry to government and regulators, and that's as much of a challenge for us as it is for any other industry representation. Our industry is huge and varied. There are two companies that are very, very big. One that's quite big, and then a long tail of everybody else. So how do you get that group of people together in order to emphasize what is the best about your industry and how you want to represent yourself to the world outside? Sometimes it's easy to get subsumed into your own world and spend a lot of time kind of looking inwards rather than looking outwards. And finally, the third part of what we do is to clear scripts for broadcast. So we clear scripts according to the BCAP code, so that if you hear something on commercial radio, you know that you can trust it, that it complies with the regulations, and that, I think, is an increasingly important weapon in our armour, to be honest. As I always say, we don't ask for no regulation, but we do ask for fair regulation. And I think it's actually, we're in a world now where Mark Zuckerberg is saying that we should have some regulation, which, let's have a wry smile at that. But anyway, regulation is a strength for us. So that's kind of where we are in Radiocentre. I suppose, what is it? So 5 years ago, I think, what is it that we can actually deliver as an organisation to all these powerful chief executives who sit around my board table? Paul Keenan, who was talking yesterday, very, very busy running a European organisation. So aside from doing the things I've just talked about, is there anything else that we can deliver to him and his fellow very, very busy chief executives that they could not do on their own? And I think that's about the power of working together. What we can do as an industry body is to look ahead at what's coming around the corner, to provide thought leadership, sometimes to be provocative in that area, but mainly to do the things which bring ourselves together with all sorts of different partners, which, with the best will in the world, none of our chief executives would ever do. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we've gone about that positioning. When we started 5 years ago, it's like, we need something that's a kind of arresting strapline, a strategy into which everything we do fits. So that we lit on see radio differently. There's a juxtaposition in seeing and the listening that's involved in radio, which we think is kind of interesting and allows us a way into lots of different conversations. We're trying to persuade all sorts of people to see radio differently. Certainly advertisers. If advertisers are thinking, oh, that's great, but it's that medium that kind of has been around for 100 years and, it's not really anything for the next generation, then we need to challenge all of those perceptions. We need to challenge our regulators to see radio differently. Regulation, like perception, quite often lags quite a long time behind the reality, but particularly now when everything in our media landscape has changed so much in the last 10 years. So there's all sorts of conversations that we need to have and actually help the government and help regulators to better regulate our industry, and we can help with that. So we just scroll back to where we started. That's what the world looked like, and it seems to me 2015 doesn't seem a very long time ago, but then those are the leaders in the UK and the US, and obviously in Ireland just had the referendum. So it kind of does feel a long time ago in some ways. And that's where we kind of decided to move on, really put this strategy into play and see how we could make it work for us across all of our industry, encompassing both the biggest players and the smallest players as well. So I want to talk to you this morning about 3 elements of that strategy, really. And the first is storytelling, which, we all love storytelling. We always have, haven't we, as a species? It's what our ancestors used to tell one another as they gathered around the campfire. So I think telling your own story is so imperative in this world that we're in. It always has been, but particularly now, when if we don't tell our own story through all the very many different ways that we have, through social media, through all the outlets that we have, then somebody else will seize that narrative and they will tell our story for us. So unless we tell people at every single opportunity that radio is at the heart of the audio revolution, then it's very easy for people to think, oh, well, it's very much a thing that was 10, 20 years ago, and it's not what people are doing now. So we need to articulate that through all the things that we do. So I'm going to talk about how we do that through our conferences, through our branding, through our events, and basically every piece of communication that we have with the outside world. Regulation. Again, we don't ask for no regulation, but we do ask for fair regulation that allows indigenous companies, indigenous media companies in particular, to compete on a level playing field with, all the myriad new pieces of new tech that are coming in from outside our shores, beyond our shores. And finally, I think it's the space that we have that many of our busy CEOs don't have, is to start thinking about the things that are coming around the corner and how we can forge interesting new partnerships that they probably wouldn't do. I mean, a classic is, what is our relationship with the BBC? What should the relationship with the commercial media sector be with the BBC as we move it further into the 21st century? It's easy, I think, to polarize us as, well, we're over here, we're the commercial people, and that's the public service broadcaster. I think that's completely wrong lens through which to view the world at present. Our industry is too small to be competing at that level. Yes, we'll compete. If BBC Sounds launches something that we think is in direct competition to Capital, for instance, of course we'll complain to the regulator about that. But on the broad strategic level, we need to work together with the BBC for the good of our industry. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about how we've done that as well. Right, so when we first got to how we're going to tell our story differently, the first thing we did to launch it was an ad campaign, because that sort of helps, doesn't it? We have got so much empirical data, talking to advertisers particularly, about why radio is very effective, in what way radio is very effective, and how basically people should be, dedicating more of their budgets to advertising on the radio. So loads of empirical data, everything that appealed to people's heads, the rational side of their brains, but it wasn't really making much difference. It wasn't cutting through, is the truth. So I think, well, we need to take a different approach here. So how about we start appealing to the heart rather than the head? So we developed an ad campaign where we called out various really big marketeers. I thought, okay, well, let's just do something. I mean, the good thing about radio is that when commercial radio in particular, is we are not the United Nations, so our tone of voice can be quite playful. We're about having fun as well. So we think, let's do something where we do something quite surprising, call out a big media, a big marketeer, and do it through the medium of song, which we broadcast a song across all of our networks at a certain time of a morning, without any pre-briefing, without telling anybody what was going to happen, and see whether we could create a huge media buzz as a result of that. So our first, I just hesitate to say victim, our first target was this chap, and I don't know whether you know him, but that is Keith Weed, who used to be, until recently, the Chief Marketing Officer for Unilever. So clearly a man responsible for a huge marketing spend, not much of which was dedicated to radio, if we're honest. So when we looked at Keith, we thought, what sort of chap does he? He looks to me like the kind of chap who might say, be a bit of a country and western guy, But, so, of course, the song that we chose to dedicate to Keith, to remind him of the marvellousness of radio, was a rap song. So at 7:30 one morning, when we were anxiously waiting for this to be played out across all of the commercial networks to see what would happen. So here's the song.
Yo. This song is dedicated to Keith Weed, Chief Marketing Officer of Unilever. Yeah. You can be the leader, Keith, we from Unilever. You can be the leader, Keith, we from Unilever. Yeah. We've got something for you, it can only make you better. It's not complicado, it's called radio. You can be the leader, you're Keith from Unilever. Yeah. We're not here to preach about this thing called reach. Nah, when you need some traction, this is your call to action. You can be the leader, you're Keith from Unilever. This is our story, true told in every household. Now we say it's in your Twitter, you like all things visual. This one, prick your ears for the oral. Advertise with us, this request is formal. That's right, Keith Weed! Yo, listen up, radio is the place to be. It's OMG to the FMC. Why don't you be the leader? Oh, Keith from Unilever. Why don't you be the leader? So this is our request, Keith. See radio differently at radiocentre.org.
That that was obviously the 60-second version, so 30 seconds is what most people played. I think it was a gift that it was called Keith Weed, to be honest, because there's just something about that name that really lends itself very well to that execution. So it's something that we tried that we never really had before. We never really had done before, and we then had to wait and see whether people. Luckily, Keith Weed's kids, his staff, all of them heard it on the way in. So, well, what's this? What's going on? So it did indeed create the buzz that we were hoping for. Keith joined in and got the PG Tips monkey to tweet us back, and we had just loads of social media traffic on that day. Most importantly for us, it was the start of a conversation with a whole load of ad agencies who were going, oh, okay, so yeah, tell us a bit more about this. So it kind of opened the door to have different kind of conversations, which is exactly what we'd hoped for. And, did Unilever decide to spend gazillions overnight on radio? Well, no, but it did also start some conversations with them, which is, I mean, all you can hope for at that stage. So that's where we started off with See Radio Differently. We then moved on to look at all our events and everything we do. Obviously, being an industry body, we do quite a lot of events. But we tended to be, if I'm honest, a little bit inward-looking. So we used to have one event a year, which was really for our members and nobody else in the audience. So what would it be like if we decided to be the external face of the, because that's going to be really good for all our members as well. So we rebranded all our events as Tuning In events. We do at least 3 a year. We have one big one in London in May, but because we are about the whole of the UK, we also travel outside of London, so we do at least 2 outside. And the makeup of the audience has changed completely, so they're now more than 50% advertisers and agencies, because that's who I believe it's much more powerful we should be talking to on behalf of the industry. We make sure we have a lot of talent there as well, so this is our latest one in London. We had Professor Green talking about his journey and how radio played a big part in his life, but it's not only about radio. He's just a very interesting person and has lots of interesting things to say, and talent for our radio stations as well. We mix that up with some political interventions. We often have a new piece of research. So all in all, we're trying to create an event that people really want to come to. Because if I'm honest, I mean, with the, many events, obviously not Radio Days Ireland, can be a little bit dull, can't they? Especially industry events. So I thought, I don't want to put on an event I myself would not want to attend. So mainly, I think our conferences are ones that I would definitely stay for, and it's only a morning, so we don't ask very much from people. And this is a recent one we had in Manchester. So Clint Boone, who was really amazing. Andy Burnham, the mayor of Manchester, a lot of things to say about radio, very, very supportive. And this, of course, is Hal Donaldson from Take That. It's the first time we've ever had to have security at one of our events. I mean, because he still has a lot of super fans, So, and 1 or 2 did actually sneak in, but hey, it made it more exciting. So he was very interesting, actually, talking about the time when Take That had sort of just gone off the boil. He said the only thing that really kept them alive was all those radio stations that kept on playing their music, so that when they were ready to come back, with or without Robbie, they were still in people's minds. So it was an interesting story. And this bit short film about our events.
The atmosphere was fantastic today.
When you grow up and you listen to your breakfast presenters, you feel like you know them.
We have so much fun. The main thing is to make sure that fun is translated to a bigger audience.
You start going on radio stations to have interviews, and people get to know more of the person behind the music, and it actually gave birth to the career that I've managed to craft in documentaries.
It's great to see what other stations or other creators are up to.
Investigating the political side and giving a voice to mental health.
Every year, the Radiocentre put together a piece of research.
Targeting people at relevant times helps turbocharge ad effectiveness.
Radio player and the work they're doing in car is really exciting.
So we have to work together across the world, get more features and functionality into that interface, get podcasts in there, get it more personalised for the drivers.
I wish that I could make the whole of my agency watch the whole of today.
just a way we're trying to articulate our story in a slightly different way, which is a bit more dynamic, so that, as Kathy said at the end of that, that's something that she can take back to her agency and go, do you know what, there's a lot going on in this industry, you need to take a second look at it. We also, because again, I was talking about the importance of collaboration. Having worked in the television industry in the UK previously, obviously there's a moment in the television industry calendar in Edinburgh where everybody goes, like the entire industry gets together. And we get sort of aware that we don't really have a similar thing for the radio industry. And so we're trying to create a kind of week where at least we really start everybody talking about radio. So we're coming up to the 3rd Radio Audio Week. This year it's going to be kicked off by the Podcast Awards, so Matt will be talking about that later on today. So we've lots of different partners across the UK putting on a whole week of events. I mean, it helps them obviously focused on London quite a lot, but it does help us to get lots of agencies in together and start talking about all the stuff that's going on in audio, which, by the way, is quite a lot. And again, to ram home that message that it's not about Spotify. It's, that this is, radio is still a large part of the digital audio world. So that allows us to articulate our message in various different ways. I'll just add in a quick plug for our Tuning In conference this year. So if anybody wants to come, do please, because we've upgraded to a bigger venue this year, and I'm slightly scared about it. We used to be at the Picture House Central in Shaftesbury Avenue, which is a capacity of about 350, but we have sold out for the last couple of years. So we've upgraded to the IMAX Cinema in Leicester Square, which is vast. So if anybody would like to have a few days in London, very much recommend this marvellous free conference. Anyway, so our latest ad campaign is the next one I wanted to talk about. For a long time, it kind of frustrated me that, the way all those amazing, cool, sleek, black-looking ads come out of Silicon Valley, and it all looks really cool and fantastic. And so our challenge to our ad agency was, what if you were to launch radio now as a completely new medium? Think about how you would do that. It took us a long time to do this, to get this right. But I was really pleased with how it came out in the end, particularly so we had some really great lines on it: unskippable, unblockable, unbeatable, really good message. This influencer has 36 million influencers, I was particularly pleased with as well. So we had lots of ad space from our friends at Global. We had lots of outdoor digital advertising, which was really impactful, and bought some space and campaign. But the thing we most loved were, of course, the radio ads.
Imagine a device so cutting edge. Accept cookies. There is a device so forward thinking. Accept cookies. A device that is so modern that. Accept cookies. Now imagine a technology where cookies don't get in the way of your brand message. Welcome to radio. Advertising that's cookie-free. See radio differently at radiocentre.org.
So we're kind of really pleased with that, and it's clearly hit a nerve in markets around the world because we're licensing those ad campaigns in various different territories. I mean, you can see how we can all have quite a lot of fun with those messages, and it's something that we can play on as well for a good time ahead. So another part of our campaign to get people to see radio differently is actually literally, because I don't know about you, but some of the photographs that you see, if there's a story about radio or audio, the photographs that are used to go alongside those in the media or on social media, they just baffle me sometimes. So why don't we shoot a whole load of lifestyle photos, this is how people listen to radio today. I saw some of them up on the screen yesterday, which I was very pleased about. So these are available for free from our website. It actually shows real modern people listening to the radio. And the reason why we felt it was necessary to do that is, I'm just going to show you a couple of examples of what we do. So this is a great piece recently from Campaign, talk about how radio can contribute to social cohesion. All of that is fabulous. And I was kind of slightly baffled by the photograph that goes with it. So made me feel a bit, well, wouldn't it look a lot better if we just had that photograph, which is actually people listening to the radio, and then you can concentrate more on what the story actually says. Well, I suppose my personal favourite is this one. So that's great. I was really pleased that City AM did this piece about, our new thing. So, and it combines two of the most egregious errors with a Lazy Buggles headline and that photograph. So, dogs, 2 dogs with little coats on, dogs with weird headphones and listen to something that clearly isn't a radio. So it's like, okay. So we had a chat with them and said, wouldn't it be better if you used that photograph? Which thankfully they did. But I mean, it's kind of, I'm being facetious, but it does make a difference because that portrays a certain image of radio and what our industry is about, which I think is just completely wrong. Just doesn't really do it. And so obviously I'm going to talk about T's and C's because I always talk about T's and C's. Very pleased when Campaign wrote this piece, or did this piece from me, about our latest breakthrough on T's and C's. But again, what is that picture? I mean, this sort of 1930s Bakelite radio with sort of Where's Wally hand coming? I don't know, anyway. Listen, we haven't cracked that one yet, but we keep trying. And same with the team, when we do, I'm going to talk about the Mental Health Minute in a minute, but when we did that campaign, Twitter gave us our own emoji, which is great. But of course the emoji was that old-fashioned transistor. And as we were saying, modern radio listening can look very, very different like this. So we can't repeat that one often enough, see radio differently, literally see radio differently. And the final part of my storytelling part, it struck me that we do, whenever we do member surveys of our industry, we have very high awareness among the kind of senior managers of what we do at Radiocentre, what materials are available, how you can use our research when you're selling to agencies, etc. But the people where that level of awareness drops tend to be the local salespeople. And I discovered that there were 700 local radio salespeople in the UK. I think, well, wouldn't it be amazing if we could get to that group of people who actually really, really need our information? So we're developing an e-learning app, which we work with an amazing company who've helped us put together just about 6 modules. It's really easy to use. You can download it onto your phone. You can do it really quickly. And, potentially that can help you if you say, right, here are the 3 things you need to know about why is radio great, why use radio in the mix with TV, Facebook, Google, wherever it is. And here are 3 sides you can download into your presentation when you're going to visit whoever it is to sell some advertising space to him tomorrow. So we're just testing that at the moment. We're having some really good results. So I'm hoping that that's going to be up and running by the end of the year because I really believe that it's great and all for us to be telling the story, but if we don't have our own people out there telling the story, then there's kind of not much point to it, really. So that is a few examples of how we're trying to reposition our industry in terms of telling the story. The next bit, of course, is regulation. It's very important. Sometimes it's difficult to find a position around which all of our industry can coalesce, but I strongly believe that unless we can do that, we're going to be in a much worse position as far as the government is concerned. If we are not seen to be united on certain issues, then I'm afraid they just stop listening to us. Government and regulators have many, many things to do, and unless you can present them with a clear proposition, I think you're kind of lost. So that's what led to commercial radio deregulation, which I talked about earlier, has allowed us to do other things that we couldn't do before. Those changes are still bedding down, and there was an anxiety, as I'm sure you're all aware, about if there's lots of networking going on, what happens to really local radio? That's a process that we're still in the process of discovering. Ofcom have now issued this consultation about increasing the level of small-scale DAB that's available, which will hopefully help to plug some of that gap. But I mean, listen, the landscape is developing, so let's watch that space. I mean, as I say, whenever we talk to regulators, it's it's important for us to have a coherent story and also to understand that regulation, like perception, often lags quite a long time behind reality. And because our reality has been galloping along in the last 10 years, it's important for us to have lots of conversations, and not necessarily always whining about anything, but how can we do this together? So the UK government at the moment is conducting a review of digital listening across the piece. They don't have the capacity to do it, if I'm honest. DCMS, as we know, not only keeps changing their ministers every other day, but also they have a lot of other things to do. And radio, in their list of priorities, I'm afraid, is not very high up the agenda. So the review is actually being conducted by industry. So we're doing it ourselves with the BBC, with lots of other players. We're being chaired by someone from DCMS, but unless we seize that opportunity, I think that somebody else is going to make those arguments, and not necessarily in a way that we want to. So it's an interesting process which is carrying on as we speak. T's and C's, of course, I know that sort of strikes a chord with our Irish friends as well, but it's something that from the first moment I started working in radio, it's like, what is that stuff? And I say, well, nobody understands it. And why do they have to broadcast it? Sadly, I know too much about why we have to broadcast it now. So we did a lot of lobbying in Europe, and actually with the change of regime at the Commission, I think things are changing slightly in Europe. So we are making headway over there, sadly and ironically in a Brexit context, but as an Irish citizen, I don't have to worry about all that sort of stuff. But we continue to work with the Association of European Radios because we've done a lot of research in this area. So we carry on making the arguments, but through our European friends rather than from Radiocentre. But simultaneously to that work that was going on in Europe, we also started talking to our own regulator, the FCA, about what can we actually, so we're not saying, again, let's not have any regulation, but let's have regulation that actually works. We don't want to mislead consumers or listeners, as we like to call them. Let us help you do this better. So at the very least, we want to have a piece of paper that is sanctioned by the regulator that says, you do not need to say this. You do not need to say 18 and over, subject to status. You will not own the car if it's a lease advert, because it's neither the time nor the place for those kinds of messages. So after long negotiations, we've produced this rather dreary-looking bit of paper, but something that we're incredibly excited about because it says FCA-confirmed industry guidance. It's about the motors industry, which of course is 90% responsible for these kind of T's and C's that you hear. We got a lot of coverage, and we did. So we were very pleased that the Times decided to put this on page 3, Radio Advanced Spare Listen to the Baffling Small Print Babble. I'm absolutely sure this is utterly unconnected to the fact that Times Radio has just launched, but I didn't care because it was on page 3 of the Times. And it also meant that we are now going out doing lots of road shows with the main motor advertisers, but this has meant that a lot of creative agencies have come to us as well, going, okay, can you tell us what this means? Because there's clearly read across to other sectors as well as motors. So look, it's not everything, but it is a start, and it's the thing that will persuade those very risk-averse compliance officers, because that sort of goes with the territory, that they don't need to load all of these terms in, and the FCA, their regulator, won't come down on them like a ton of bricks. So I think it's an important first step towards more sensible regulation in this field, or I hope so anyway. And hopefully you can use that in this market as well, because the fact that it exists somewhere else and a regulator has said this it has got to be a good thing. I mean, that's why I always talk about the importance of regulation, because I think it goes a long way towards carrying on building that relationship of trust that we have with our listeners. We heard a lot about it in the news session yesterday. People trust our brands, and that currency is becoming more and more important and will continue to do so in our social media landscape. So we wouldn't want to do anything that broke that bond of trust, because we know it's fantastically important. This is some research we did last year. asking commercial radio listeners, who do you most trust? Where does for your sources of news? I think the really interesting things about that graph is the top 2 highly regulated media sectors, and look at that level of trust. And at the bottom, 15%. I mean, 15% of people actually trust what they read on social media, or so they say. And yet, how it appears to have had such a massive effect on so many parts of our lives. So that's an interesting statistic in itself. And that's the European Commission's Trust Barometer, something that's repeated across Europe. So we have a very important commodity, which is trust. And we really, really need to build on that. And every conversation we have with regulators is about the same subject. It's always part of what we do. And as I was saying, we have our own team internally that, again, make sure that everything that we broadcast in terms of advertising complies with all the regulations, and you can trust it. And it's something that our advertisers have been very keen to talk about to the world outside. So we've got this Radiocentre Trust Mark, which shows that you are a responsible advertiser who is concerned about your consumers and concerned about keeping to a certain standard. So that is something that we have promoted as a badge of trust, if you like, which I think, again, has proved very, very popular with our advertisers. So that's kind of the bit about regulation and how we talk to regulators. We're in touch with Ofcom and DCMS a lot. And when we need to, we make common cause with the BBC. We're a relatively small industry. You'll have seen all the latest developments with the BBC, some kind of slightly mad statements coming out of Number 10. But I think people should be careful what they wish for. If commercial operators think that if BBC were privatised or BBC Radio didn't exist, that would suddenly lead to a whole load of goodies for the commercial sector, because I think it's actually more complicated than that. So anyway, that's the subject of a whole other thing. So coming on to just sort of look future gazing and looking at how we can help forge new partnerships, do different things that maybe our big companies on their own haven't got the bandwidth to do. I mean, the most obvious one is all of our companies, is in Radio Player. That is a fantastic collaboration between the BBC and the commercial sector that started in 2011 as kind of, what are we going to do about the fact that, we can't all have apps. We need to have one app that can be really easy for consumers. And Mike Hill and his team have sort of done a great job of kind of spreading that across Europe. They've got so many new members now. Real focus on in-car, because there's one thing those car manufacturers, as all global businesses, don't want to deal with. It's a whole load of different broadcasters. So if we don't do this ourselves, then someone else will come in and aggregate all of our content. So there's a huge self-interest involved, but it does mean that we have to put aside a lot of the things that, they were not the ways we would always have worked, put it like that. So I think it's definitely persuaded us to collaborate in a way that probably 10 years ago may not have been possible. So I talked earlier about, trying to use the power of our medium. The one thing that radio really has, I think we heard a lot about it yesterday in our interventions, is the power to be simultaneously incredibly intimate and yet at the same time part of a broad shared experience. And we thought, what better medium in a way to highlight the importance of talking, to highlight the whole issues of mental health. So a few years ago, we got together with the Royal Foundation. So what would it be like if we managed to broadcast 1 minute across the whole of the networks, BBC and commercial radio and community radio and prison radio? What if we could achieve doing that all in 1 minute? To highlight an increasingly important problem in modern day society. So we're in our 3rd year now, we're coming up to our 3rd year, we're just planning this year's, but I want to just play you a little bit about how that played out across various radio stations in the UK.
Something very special is about to happen next. The Mental Health Minute with Heads Together. Loads of big names, including Katy Perry and the Duke of Cambridge, coming together to talk all things mental health, something we've all experienced in one way or another, something we should never be ashamed or afraid to talk about. It's a really special moment, and it's happening next on Capital.
Good morning. It's almost 10:59 on Monday, 13th of May.
This is Greatest Hits Radio, and we're about to join hundreds of radio stations and millions of listeners all across the UK for a special broadcast
to recognise the importance of Mental Health Awareness Week.
It's going to be broadcast across hundreds of stations to millions of listeners across the UK.
This is Mental Health Awareness Week, and we'd like to take a minute to join up with the Royal Foundation's Heads Together campaign to have a think about our mental health.
It's a really important message from Heads Together about the power we all have to make a difference to someone else.
Now, you may notice some familiar voices, including Katy Perry,
Stephen Fry, Jamila Jamil, Alicia Dixon and Prince William.
It has a very important message, so let's take a minute.
To listen. To really listen.
Are you listening? Are you really listening? Answer these questions out loud. What does SHOP spell? And what do you do at a green light? Stop? Or should you go on green? Katie?
I'd say stop. I mean, most people do. So while we are listening, we're not really listening. Jamila?
We do it all the time, in one ear and out the other. Life can just get too busy, can't it, Mr. Fry?
It can indeed, but there are people out there desperate to be heard, and you can help by taking the time to listen, even if you're a prince.
Being able to talk about how you're feeling is essential for keeping mentally fit and healthy. So maybe now is the time for us to stop and to really listen.
Right now, you are one of 20 million people listening.
On more than 300 radio stations.
And each and every one of us has the power to make a difference to someone.
Just by taking a minute to stop.
And to listen. To really listen.
So it's kind of I was blown away by the amount of support we had for that particular initiative. So people didn't only play the minute, but they did lots of other things around it too. So it really started something, and that again speaks to the power of our media and working together. And it's nothing to do with whether it's the BBC or whether it's commercial radio. It's about something different. It got a huge amount of coverage as we had all of those amazing names, and award-winning, so that always helps, doesn't it? But you know, more importantly, I think it just positions our industry in a very interesting place, and as part of an important force for good, for social cohesion, all of those things that we all in this room kind of take for granted. But it's important to articulate that, especially when we've got very powerful, you know, incoming forces who cannot actually say the same thing. They really can't. And it's been nominated for the Radio Times Radio Moment of the Year. I'm not sure it'll win because it's got some very strong competition, but I'm really, really proud that it was nominated. It kind of showed a moment of the industry working together for something that was a really good cause. Young talent, obviously, none of our industry is a cliche, but you know, unless we concentrate on the talent that's coming through, you know, there's not going to be an industry in about 10 to 15 years' time. So there was a bit of a gap in the market. In the UK, certainly, Student Radio Awards are very, very powerful, very good, and a lot of people find a way into the industry through that route. But before that, kind of 8 to 18-year-olds, there really wasn't much around for kids. So we thought, well, why not set up an awards scheme? We know it's never been easier to make your own audio. We know there's loads of kids making audio in schools, you know, in their bedrooms. So we did it for the first time last year. The entries have just closed for this year. It was fantastically popular. Again, the BBC, fantastic collaboration with the BBC, because they broadcast it on all their outlets just as we did. And here is kind of summary of what it's about.
The Young Audio Awards are for 8 to 18-year-olds and schools who love creating radio and podcasts. Brought to you by the BBC and commercial radio, with categories including Rising Talent, Best Podcast and School Station of the Year. There's a range of awards for all. Young presenters, reporters and schools can enter to win money can't buy prizes, handed out at a star-studded ceremony at the BBC Radio Theatre. Prizes for winners include shows on a national radio station, top-of-the-range equipment, mentoring with radio superstars, and a showcase on BBC Sounds. So if you're passionate about radio and audio, then the Young Audio Awards could be your first step to stardom. Find out more about the simple entry process, see the full list of categories, and enter for free at youngaudioawards.co.uk.
I can honestly say that is one of the best things I've been involved in since I've been working commercial radio. So, we're getting to the stage where we're going to be moving on to next year, and let's build some more for there. Lisa's making a lot of signs for me at the back of the room here. So I've got loads of amazing things to say, but she's not going to let me. So therefore, my main message for you really is that I think we've done a lot of interesting things by putting together different partnerships, by surprising people in the articulating our story. It's been a bit of a journey. We're still going on, but any help or advice or support or anything else I can give you, I'll be more than happy to. So, am I wrapping up? Are there two questions only. To ask me about the amazing bit I was going to talk about that I haven't had time to. It's really good. Yes, hello.
Siobhan,
hi.
Really good presentation, thank you.
Can I just ask?
Sorry?
Where are you from?
I'm from a station called Play Irish, but my background is primarily advertising.
Right.
And it's really just a question in relation to the agencies. I know that most agencies are generally more obsessed now with podcasting and digital audio. How do you keep that perspective with agencies, given the work that you're doing in the UK? It seems to be a constant battle to keep radio to the
Well, it's a really interesting question. So you have to keep articulating the numbers, for one thing. The 75% of the audio day is still spent on live radio. It's not on podcasts, it's not anything else. But I would never, almost for us, it's riding on the back of that wave. The fact that suddenly agencies, whereas the head of radio was beginning to be a diminishing role in an agency, now suddenly, because of podcasts, because of everything that's available in digital audio, it's started to be more sexy again. So for me, that represents a massive opportunity, actually, because more people want to talk to us now. So yeah, of course we can talk about digital audio, DAX, all the things that our members are doing, but it's a massive opportunity to go on. By the way, there's this thing called radio, and it's really good, So I think you have to just and that's why we have to think of ever more inventive ways to do the ad campaigns or our research, because you need to grab people's attention, especially when, as you say, they're thinking it's all about podcasts. So yeah, I think it's an iterative process. You've got to keep going on it, but we have got a better. In my perception, things have moved on in 5 years, and they've moved in our favour. So it's easier for us to have those conversations now because agencies are more engaged with the world of audio in general.
Okay.
So I think it's good for us.
Hi there, Michael O'Keefe. I'm from the Regulator. Just wanted to touch on one of the issues that you raised, which was the T&Cs, the dreaded T&Cs.
The dreaded T&Cs.
Because we did some work with the central bank before, and they weren't moving, they weren't budging. We did give a concession, as you know, in the last code that we introduced, which was that we don't count T&Cs for minutage anymore, so that's excluded from the advertising minutage time that people have. But just so I want to say that the central bank, I understand, are going to run a consultation very shortly again to cover that topic and topics like that, and I would encourage the industry to engage in that, because it is, for us as regulators and the industry, it is a very frustrating it cannot be enjoyable for listeners to listen to.
Well, I think that's the point, really. Yeah. So, and you as regulators, and that's what I've found with the FCA is actually they have worked very constructively with us, because they, no one wants to be the person who's responsible for that assault on the nation's ears. So, in fact, if we can work together, then I think you're right. And the fact that we've actually got something now out of the UK regulator, hopefully that kind of opens a door to other conversations.
I think it should. And one other point then, just to make, is that obviously with a new government, hopefully coming in shortly, the question of regulation, deregulation, because we do concede that a lot of the regulations that the radio sector works under are 30 years, as we acknowledged. It needs to be modified, and the best time to modify legislation is at the sort of the beginning of the term and engagement with the minister. So again, I would urge, when the new government is in place, that I think the industry should take action on that.
Very good. Good advice. Okay. Thank you all very much. Thank you.